Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another illustration masterclass episode. Today we're looking at the artist Hoi Mun. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. Uh, if not, then I apologize. If you watch this channel, you know how terrible I am at pronouncing names. But we're going to look at this guy's work, or this female's work, and we're going to take some notes on what it is that's cool about it. And that's how I do tutorials on this channel. I like to look at other people's work and just try to understand what I love about what they do and what I can learn from what they do, right? So the first thing it is that I noticed with this piece, I really like how dynamic this is. You know, there's not a lot going on. It's just this very dynamic gesture that's happening here. I might even have to turn this blue just to get this right, right? So you got this very dynamic gesture that's going like this. And notice that it's coming off the page, and you have like these black strokes of paint that are flying up this way and up here, and they're morphing into the shadows that are being used on the body here, right? Same thing with the guitar, right? He differentiates the shadow of this ink splash in the background from the guitar. Um, right? He differentiates it with these white lines. But the other thing is really interesting about it is that he's only using two tones and a half tone on the figure, right? Like he's got this ink brush here with this really interesting hatching style that he's doing. All throughout here, he's doing this sort of thing, right? And then he's got this half tone that he's dropping in there to give a little bit of gradient, a little bit of shadow to his inks. I think that's really cool. And I really wonder like what kind of brush he's using, because it looks like he's just using a brush that has this kind of a comb kind of aesthetic to it. Anyway, this looks really dynamic. It looks really cool. Um, you know, again, it's interesting to point out that the everything is sitting on this side of the image, but even there's a balance to it because this big black ink streak goes across all the way across the page, right? And here too. So it's like it fans out, right, along with the arm. Of course, it's kind of following the same line of the gesture of the arm and the same gesture of the body in general, right? So you could say it's coming like this and here. Yeah, it's basically a diagonal, right? Same thing here. Same thing here. Same thing here. Right? All right, let's move on to the next one. Again, it's just like his ability, or her ability. I apologize, I'm not sure what the gender or even how to pronounce this artist's name. So, but what I really like about this is the way it is that he loses. You can tell that this was originally drawn with line, but then after being drawn with line, the artist decided that they were going to lose the line and just use shadow, use these little touches of shadow here in order to suggest the overlapping of forms, right? Because typically what we would do is we would have like a black pen, and we would sit here and we would go like, okay, so it was like this, like this, right? And not that there's anything wrong with this, right? Not that there's anything wrong with what this is. You can still see that it's, you know, it's visually appealing. But he uses if you pull back, you can see the difference, right? With that line work and then without it. And even though I do love line art in general, I do like this approach. I do think this is a pretty cool approach, because he's basically, or this artist is basically using this And the technical term of it, I think, is like ambient occlusion or something like that, which is basically like when two things are they're overlapping and they're creating this kind of shadow effect, right? Like here, like we're seeing inside of the shirt a little bit. And so we get that kind of effect, but then he's also showing us the form that's churned towards us the most, which is this, right? And he's doing that by putting the highlight. So he's showing the churn of the form down here and here in a very subtle, interesting way. And he's getting away with a lot with very little, with really very little work, right? And then he's balancing this level of detail, which is, even though this illustration doesn't have a lot of detail, um, this side of things has even less detail, right? He's falling more into the background. The value range that's going on in his head, and even here on the collar, all of this I would say is closer together, and we can prove this by dropping in a grayscale. We're going to drop a grayscale in, and then we can go saturation, yeah, saturation. All right. So there is more contrast there's more variation in the um, in the values here in her. As you can see, I'm poking around here, and we have pretty light values, we have medium values, and then we have even some slightly darker values on the sword and in the shadow for her hat, right? Whereas with him, if we start poking around, we can see that the lightest color is, it's pretty light. But in general, they have well, actually, they do go kind of dark. But nothing goes completely white, right? Like you could imagine that if this was as white as this, then it would really be confusing to the eye because your eye would be going up here because it would create so much contrast in this area, right? That's what we'd be doing. So instead, he's doing the same thing that I've talked about in previous episodes, which is that he's keeping the contrast where he wants your attention to be, which is going to be obviously on her face and his face, right? And it's not a coincidence that we have this kind of zigzag kind of thing going on here, right? And then we look at the face, and it's also got this diagonal, right? But there's also this diagonal going here. And it's almost like it goes here, it hits this, and then it goes around and it points us back to her face, right? All of these design decisions were very intentional. And it was very intentional to hide half of her face behind the shadow. And it looks very dramatic and very cool because the half of the face is lost in the shadow, and only her eyes and the silhouette of her hair are really poking out, which is really cool, right? Like he subtly gives a little bit of a difference in the background here, subtly, but not much. Let's go ahead and let's move on to the next one. This guy's got some awesome work. I mean, this is incredible to me. Like the shape values and stuff like that. Like if you want to understand how to design something like this, you want to design like some crazy looking mech type stuff. You want to do some silhouette studies of an artist like this, right? Like this artist, he's just wild with his design. I love it. I love the design. It feels like he probably took like maybe some photo bash elements, maybe took some motorcycles or something and just kind of mashed it all together. It looks really great. But you can tell that this artist also has the ability to do a very strong inking style, right? And you can see how he's using different types of strokes in order to create different kinds of effects. So here we see in the water, we get this sensation of something moving. And so we have these strokes that are going horizontally across. Then you have the rocks themselves, and they have a slight curve to them. And they're not all curved the same way. He does a few curves. He does, it looks like 5 lines, 5 or 6 lines, and then he switches it up and he goes to another angle and another angle. And he's just constantly finding these different angles, right? And then he's darkening one side of it. And this is coming up here. And then obviously, you know, we have all this detail here. And we have different shadow shapes that sit here and sit here. But you could almost say that like these shadow shapes, they kind of create like a step. It goes here, and then there's another shadow, and then we have our main figure, which stands like this, right? And so on one side of the piece, we have these very strong, dark shapes, right? And including with the character in that, right? And over here we have a lot more line work going on rather than over here, right? Some of this falls into line work, but there's much more. There's more forms being explored in these different line works, right? And so there's this contrast between these bold black shapes over here and all these shadows and this more thin line work. And he balances that out by putting these shadow shapes here, right? Even here. This was the piece that when I saw this artist art station, I was like, this guy is amazing. I mean, it's just an incredible piece that like I don't even know what there is to say about it other than yeah, just look at it. Like the design that's there. There's a lot of symmetry going on, right? Like you have suggestions of symmetry, right? Like this. Obviously, the stance of the robot and then the stance of her, very symmetrical. But then he breaks the symmetry up with different guns in both hands. He reinforces the symmetry with these bullets back here and with the way that the sign is, but even the sign is not completely symmetrical. You know, we have this circle shape over here, and then we balance that with 2 smaller ones over here, right? Obviously, the kanji in the background is not all the same. This line goes here, so you have 2 lines over here, and then you have a big line over here. And then even here you have these circle shapes. All of this stuff is kind of contrasting off of one another. Interesting little triangle shape goes right here, and it's also here, and then it's also repeated in the figure itself, which is interesting. Right? So it's like repeating shapes. It's like circular shapes and triangle shapes repeated on different levels within the illustration. But honestly, I mean, the piece just looks brilliant. It looks so good. I'm curious if this stuff is done traditionally or not. Because if it's done traditionally, which the more that I scroll in, it does look like it's done traditionally. Looks like this is some ink wash or maybe some marker and some pen. It's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. All right, we got 1 or 2 left. Let's go ahead and let's wrap it up. That one, I think I'm actually going to skip that one. I like this one, but I'm going to skip it. Yep, this is the one I want to end it on. This is obviously going to be the thumbnail, because why wouldn't it be? How fucking cool is that? How freaking cool is that? Sorry, YouTube. Hopefully you don't shadow ban me. But again, it shows that you can suggest a lot with very little. You can suggest so much with very little. And this is a great example of that. If I zoom in here, and I look at it, there's obvious things that I notice. The silhouette read from a distance is awesome. We have this strong diagonal that's going this way. We have another strong diagonal that's going this way. The arms are moving diagonally. And obviously we have good elements of contrast because the head and the torso is contrasting against the armor, right? But even in the background, you can tell there's some photo or something of like a background back here, and it looks like they dropped a red onto it, and they kept those values pretty close. So it creates this kind of gradation of color, and it almost gives you this sense that they're walking through some sort of battlefield or something. That was my first instinct whenever I saw this. It was like they just got done with a battle or something like that, and they're walking away from it, or they just made the final kill or something. Really cool work. Anyway, you can check out this artist's work in the description box below. Thanks guys for watching. If there's anybody else that you would like for me to look at, please feel free to drop a link to some other artist's work in the description box. Thanks guys. Take it easy.